This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. I'm visiting with Mrs. Dan Hogan, and I want to get your maiden name, your full maiden name.
Oh, it was Fay Bills.
Fay Bills Hogan.
Yes, Fay Bills Hogan.
Usually when we start an interview, I ask the background of the individual. I wonder if you could tell me who your father and mother were, and if they came to Oklahoma, when and how they happened to come here.
Well, they came from Texas, and my mother's name was Alice Virginia Reagan, and my father's was William Asbury Bills, and they were married in Texas, you know, and he was in business there, but he came when the state was very young, and went into business here, and at one time had several stores in the western part of the state. He was a merchant, but he was very active and was interested in one of the banks there. And
what were his stores?
Well, they were just. We had two older brothers. I have a twin sister, and we're the youngest. And there were two boys, and then two girls that had passed away, and then an older sister that I lost last year, and then my twin sister and I. And they're all gone, but my twin sister and I. And he put the boys in school. It was merchandising, drugstores, and then general. What would you call that?
Kind of general stores, weren't they?
General stores, But then he had these drugstores early, you know, and.
Did the stores have a single name or?
No, and not that I recall. Floyd and I were quite small at that time, and but he had them in different locations, and. You know, of course, did extremely well, and he had. I know when we were taking music, he had hardware, and then he also had pianos, and then he had three stores in our hometown.
What town was that?
Cordell. Now that was early, and that's where we'd play the piano. Of course, she was more talented in music than I. She'd always play what is it? Up here, and I'd play the bass, you know. Yes. But I took music, you know, along with her when we were in college, harmony and all of that. But she could just hear anything and play it.
Could you describe the general stores as you best remember them?
Well, at this one place for the younger boy of the two, he had a drugstore, and then of course next door was ready to wear, and then we hired. My father hired managers for those others, you know, because there were just the two boys. Well, and then he had the ones at home, my father, and they were just like you'd go into out in some, well, just like you'd go into Anthony's or any place like that where they had all kinds of ready to wear, and then he had the drugstore separately. It's like, you know, at camps, yeah. we trade there, and they just had his 90th birthday, and someone made a little replica of an early grocery store, you know, where the carrots and apples were in the basket. So I guess they were something like that.
Something like that. We did
it was pretty grand to me.
We did an interview with Mr. Camp about a month or so ago.
Did you?
Yes, very interesting one. Where did you go to college?
I went to Texas Christian.
Mm-hmm. And you graduated in in music? Or did you?
No, I graduated in just education.
Education.
Mm-hmm. I taught.
Oh. Can you describe? Now, you went to school in Cordell, your public school.
Yes.
Right? Could you describe the schools at Cordell as you remember them?
Well, they were very good. You know, of course, they had a north and a south school, and then and there was a college there. You know, early.
Yes, Cordell Christian College.
Cordell Christian College. And when we first started in the grades, my father had us go there, and he had us take all music and everything they offered there, all of us.
That college was in some respects a predecessor to this college.
Yes, I think so.
Now, where did you teach when you?
Well, I taught at Cordell.
You taught at Cordell.
And then I taught 1 year at Claremore.
Mm-hmm. What year did you teach at Claremore?
Oh, Lord, I can't remember. I think it was, 1930.
Oh.
I don't remember that. Let's see.
Well,
see, I don't want this on record.
Oh, no.
Maybe.
In Cordell, could you tell us, as you recall, some of the leaders or some of the personalities of the community that who kind of stand out to you as leaders?
Well, there was my father and Mr. Calloway and
What was
Mr.
his first name? Do you remember?
J.M. Calloway, I believe, and Mr. Armfield. They were and of course the doctors there, Dr. Farber. But my father was very active in everything, and he was on the board of one of the banks, on two, one earlier than they pulled out here. The Finnertys had one there, and my father was the only one there that they had on the board. And they wanted him to be president, but he said, well, I just don't know anything about banking. They said, well, we don't want you in for anything. We can hire all that. We want you in to tell to the value of land and all that, to direct the loans.
Were the Finnertys the ones who later came to Fidelity and became president of Fidelity?
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
And
that goes way back there.
that goes way back. And that was when we were just, I don't remember that at all. We were just babies, I guess.
Well, Mr. Finnerty died in 1924, so I know it was quite a ways back then.
Well, one of them did. One of them.
The one who was president of Fidelity.
Well, there were two. There was Fred Finnerty and Roy. Well, Roy lived on.
No, Fred Finnerty died.
Yes. Well, Roy lived on, and after after Mr. Hogan and I were married, and I know when I come, he'd shout out. Well, that shouldn't be on television. I mean, on this tape. After he found out that I was my father's daughter, he said when we'd go into the Lotus Club, Mr. Hogan belonged to everything in town. He'd say, "Hello, Fay," and all the way across that huge room up there at the Scurvy, embarrassed me to death. And but he didn't know it for some time. And there was a doctor's wife there that was very amusing, and her husband was considerably older than she, but she swore. I know that shouldn't be on. You better turn that off. But he came said to me one
you
night.
Didn't give her name anyway, so
he said one night at the party out the Nichols. He said, "Faye, couldn't she swear the most elegantly of anybody you?" And she could. It didn't sound bad, but my father was very much opposed to it. But he thought Miss Farber was just all right.
An expert at it.
But she'd she'd get after him and said, she called him Alice and Bill said, why don't you stop waiting on these children? And but they didn't pay attention to it. They were just fine people. And so as we grew older and as they became ill, she said, well, I'm sure they're getting it in return because we were devoted to them.
Do you have any recollections at Claremore of incidents or things that happened that might be of interest?
No, I was in fact, I was going to be married. I think I wasn't too interested in the school. But I mean,
where Rogers was living then, that was his hometown. Did he ever come there when you were there?
No, I was there. I was just there 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
And so.
What about the military academy there? Was it pretty active there?
Yes. But I don't know much about Claremore. I thought this was more that you wanted the.
What I want to get into is Oklahoma City and Mr. Hogan and the bank and some of the things you recall about that. So when you and Mr. Hogan were married, what year?
1946.
1946.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were you in Oklahoma? Were you in Oklahoma City earlier than that? Were you?
Yes.
Did you live here earlier than that?
Oh yes. Well, I was here, and well, I don't care to describe that, but he the way I met him, but he advised a bank down there he told me during the Depression, and the two young fellas, and just kept the bank going because they were just ready to give up. But I didn't know him at all then. And then when I was here, but he took a loan away from me, and the man asked me, I didn't realize, of course, I was fairly young, and to go down and let Mr. Hogan have this loan that he was getting it for 5%, and we had it at 9%. So I didn't pay attention to the letters.
You were where then?
I was here. I just kept an apartment here after.
No, but I mean from the loan. You.
It was Clinton.
Oh, I see.
And so I went down. That was when I met Mr. Hogan.
Was that when the Sewells had the Clinton Bank?
Yes.
And they later came to Liberty Bank.
Well, Senior Hogan Sr.
The younger one did too for a while.
Did he? I didn't. I
Yes,
didn't know that.
for a while when Mr. Sewell was president. You first began living in Oklahoma City after you were married to Mr. Hogan. Is that right, or were you living here earlier?
Well, yes, I had lived here, earlier. Well, my first husband and I.
I see. I like to get a description of some, as you may recall them, of some of the Oklahoma City places that you may recall at that time during your earlier period.
46, you mean?
No, prior to 46. Do you? How far back were you living in Oklahoma City?
Well, quite a few years before that, and it was just everything was downtown. Of course, it's changed terrifically. Well, just in the last few years, and all the. My husband then moved his bank, Mr. Hogan, moved his bank from on Main and Harvey, Main and Broadway there. He had it on, he was in with Hugh and Frank Johnson. He was, a loan man. But Frank Johnson, as I understand it, and I don't know whether this, he wanted to have the largest bank in the Southwest. And Mr. Hogan wanted to own the control of his bank. So he pulled away and started the Farmers National Bank, changed it to City National Bank, and it grew under his direction quite a lot.
To become the largest bank, they eventually had to merge with the First National. Was he with the tradesmen when was he? Was
no, he wasn't with the tradesmen. He never was.
With the First National then. With Mr. Johnson.
He was with Hugh and Frank Johnson, and then he pulled away to own the bank, the Farmers National on Grand.
I thought, I may be mistaken, I thought, though, that Hugh and Frank Johnson headed separate banks, one the tradesman, one the first, and then they merged.
No, they never were in the tradesman. That was Mr. Walker.
Mr. Walker.
Walker. He made his money, he was quite a successful oil man. But, and he became old and he bought his building, and of course the bank expanded greatly.
I'd like to get a little into the reminiscences that, and this, some of this will predate your marriage to Mr. Hogan, but there are things that I'm sure he may have told you. One is, you mentioned that his working his way through school with the molasses. Can you tell this the way he described it to you?
Well, he said his father died, and his mother, there were 5 boys, I think, and 3 or 4 girls, and he said, she told the boys, said, now if you can make make a living for us, I can cook for you. I can keep the home. They were young, so he started in this. But he said he was very conservative. He saved his money, but then he decided to go to college, and he did. And he said when he was first in college, that they stood up. They just had these high tables when they ate. That all they had was prunes and hash most of the time, But he kept going and said he went the first year, and
where was this? Which college?
Oh, in Missouri. Can't think of it.
That's right.
And so he said he went to take the examinations in English, and said he always carried his books strapped, and said he sat down there and he looked at the questions, and he said he strapped them up again and told the professor that he just take that subject again the next year. But he roomed with a fellow that was studying medicine, and as one of the prominent women here in town said, that was more in his age, said, "But I never have." Said he had a bank, and then after he got out with he organized the bank in Yukon, and then it grew, and he sold it to one of the men in the bank, and moved to Muskogee, and started, and was president of a bank there. And Lou Dion, Mrs. Lou Dion, her first husband was a judge, second one was judge, and she said, "Faye, how does he know little?" Said he was describing the bones or something. My mother had broken her hip. I said, "I don't know, Ludi." No, his rock formation. I said, "I don't know, Ludi." We were out at the hotel in Colorado Springs, but I said, "We don't know," and he tells us this. I said, "So we just have to believe him." I said, But he did. He was versatile, but she said to her husband, Judge Owen, said he was on the board in Muskogee. He said, I've never seen anything like him. And he was always gray since he's 29. He was very distinguished looking. And said, but they had fever, and I don't know that in that part of the state. So he came back to Oklahoma City and went in with Hugh and Frank Johnson. And they've long since died, way before he did. And
Miss Hugh Johnson's living, though.
yeah, she's still living. And then he pulled away from them to have a bank of his own. And he still owned ones in the western part of the state, and we owns the control, because he said, I don't want to own anything that I can't have something to say about it. Like, of course, it's all getting that way now. Like AT&T stocks and bonds, you just don't. But he liked to be able to control it, and he was quite able to.
The early period you mentioned before we were on tape, we had not mentioned it again. That is the sorghum, the molasses thing you were talking about. I want you to describe that whole thing. Tell the setting for it, and as you remember it. Or
Well,
you remember his
we have 50 pictures of it, and he said he'd drive that around, and he got 50 cents a week.
Well, we haven't said on tape what he was doing.
He was driving making molasses, driving the mule around that, and that's the way they made it. And so the fellow was so impressed with him that he sold it to him. And so then he ran it and hired others, too. And he saved his money and then went to college and was graduated from this college. I have the picture of it and all. And he went out, and then he taught school one year.
Do you remember where the molasses was?
In Missouri, some small town in Missouri, and then he went to work for a banker, and he swept out. He went to the bank. Should have told the students this, and he went to the bank early in the morning. He swept out, and he cleaned the spittoons, and did all that. But the fellow developed tuberculosis and had to go to Colorado. So he said, "Now, Dan, I want you to run this bank." So he just had to get down and run it,
How old was he then?
Well, I think he's only 22 or 3, and so he did. And then the fellow was up there, came back, and he said, "Well, I've saved my money," and said, "I've just decided to own a bank." So he got a charter and put one in at Yukon. And but while he was there, he liked to mount animals. He was a great hunter. And he said the Jenner there, he'd go down there and said he got a lot of advice from the old Jenner there. But he would mount these animals, and some of the animals that he has mounted are out at the Oklahoma City University.
Was it the City National or the Liberty National that had the big buffalo head in it for many years? Do you remember? It may have been the Liberty.
It was probably the Liberty. I don't recall it. Not in my time.
Now. Can you? Did he have any recollections about the Yukon Bank that you remember?
Well, of course, saloons were open. He said one saloon man was on his board, but Mr. Hogan never drank. He didn't even drink Cokes or coffee. He said he just didn't think. He said, well, in fact, they were so poor when he was growing up they couldn't afford coffee, and so he never acquired the taste of it, and he didn't believe in having liquor, and
that may have been the secret to his longevity.
Yes, and but he never made a fuss about it. Of course, at many parties here, they serve it, and most anywhere you go. But he just took a 7-Up and went on, and he was remarkable. He was an avid bridge player, hunter, and those were the two things he liked. He didn't play golf. He didn't care for it. But he did like to hunt. And I went with him, and after the men would leave, we'd go up to a ranch up here northwest, and then he'd have me come out. He always liked an audience, getting 2 shots at one is a cubby. And he was thin and tall and very healthy, he never was ill until he broke his hip.
Yes, he looked very active up until the last couple of years, I suspect.
Did you meet him?
Yeah. Oh, yes, I knew.
Mm-hmm.
The now he moved to. What were the circumstances that brought him from Yukon to Oklahoma City? Am I correct? Is that the move, or did he go from Yukon to Muskogee?
Yeah, he went from Yukon to Muskogee.
Oh, what were the circumstances, as he told you, that brought him from Yukon to Muskogee?
Well, he just wanted a bigger place, a bigger bank, and he was up there, and he had very prominent men up there on his board, and he then when the family, I think, were ill quite a bit. What is that they have up there? With malaria, and so he moved back here, and from then on he was quite successful. He enjoyed everything. He enjoyed speaking, and he was on every board here and belonged to everything in town.
Was his move from Yukon to Oklahoma City? He moved at that time into the Farmers State Bank. Is that right?
Farmers National.
Was it national by that
Well,
time?
I don't know.
It started off Farmers State. I
Did
didn't
it?
know. Yes.
You remember back then?
Oh no, I didn't live here then, but I know that a little
yes.
of the background of the bank.
Well, yeah, I don't know whether it was Farmers National, Farmers State.
It started. It became, I think, Farmers National, and then City National.
Yeah. Oh yes, and then he changed the name. And
did he change it from Farmers to City?
Yes.
Did he? What did he say were the circumstances behind changing the name?
Well, he just he thought it would be more appealing in a city, the City National, and the one we have out west, is City National. They changed that. They called
Where
him
is it?
in Sayre,
Oh.
and he owns the interest in others, and one in Texas, and he. The bank, the president died out there, and see, they have correspondent bankers all over the state and even out of the state. And they called him and said, the president, and said, "Would you come out, Mr. Hogan, and take over this bank?" He said, I will if you can get me the control. Said, "I can't do a thing unless you get me the control." And Mr. Hullum, a very fine merchant there, so he got him control, and he went out and bought it, and he brought that bank up from about 100,000 to $1 million. Well, in several years, it is that.
When he moved into the Farmers Bank, who did he purchase from? Do you recall?
No, I don't.
You
I
don't?
wouldn't know that.
I don't recall whether he moved in as president. Is that correct that he did? I was thinking he did not.
No, he didn't. He finally acquired. They I think, recognized, one man recognized his ability and said, "I'm going to sell you my stock." And not all of it, but he finally, became had controlling interest.
So he actually moved from president of a Muskogee bank to a lesser position in the Oklahoma City Bank, but it was was it because of the health
Yes, he moved back here within. Well, I don't know how much interest he had in the First National. I think Hugh and Frank were together then. I'm not sure, and. But as I say, Frank Johnson had the vision of the greatest bank, in the Southwest, and I believe the First National is one of them, unless it's Houston,
You possibly, yes. It all depends
and he
on how you measure it now.
He admired that bank, but he wanted to dictate the policies, when he went. And bought this and got the Farmers National and changed it into the City National.
Now, as I recall, when I first came here in '48, the slogan of the City National, I may be wrong, but the term "friendly" was in it. The bank that's friendly, was that the term, or was it something like that? It was small enough to know you. Was that the what was the slogan? Do you remember?
To serve you.
That's right. That's what it was. Small enough to know you and big enough to serve you. Did Mr. Hogan create that slogan? Were there any particular circumstances behind, as you know, behind his coming up with that idea?
No. He wrote poetry, but there's one incident about his hunting. Would you like to hear that?
Yes.
the man that owned the Robo Brown, I mean Johnny Brown was Robo Brown then. He used to go hunting with, owned the building.
Was that Rohrbaugh or was it Brown that he went with?
No, he didn't go hunting with. He went with Brock, Mr. Brock.
Oh, Mr. Yes, way back there.
Mr. Brock.
Yeah.
And his son.
Sidney Brock, wasn't it? Sidney Brock.
Yeah, I guess it was Sidney, because his grandson was named Sidney, and he worked in the bank. Well, they went out to the Rockies and hunting the deer. I don't know what they were hunting, and so they had signals that if anyone was hurt, that they would fire a gun. So but they said all the rest of them rode to the hunting ground, but said Dan walked. He had long strides, and so he heard the shot and went over there, and one of the horses had kicked Mr. Brock and broken his leg. And he was a Christian Scientist, and now, as I said, my husband never, didn't touch liquor at all, but they had liquor along, of course, some of the hunters, and so he got right to work, and he said, tear me some strips of, I don't know, some blankets or something, and said, get me some, and they whittled the strips, but he wouldn't relax, and Mr. Hogan said, well, give him some of that liquor, and they forced him to take it, and as they did, Dan jerked his leg and set his leg. So, of course, then they took him to the, took him where he could get back home, And he was a very vain man, so they took him to the hospital, and he went in traction. And so they stretched that leg so much that he got it longer than the other. So he had to go back and have that done. So when someone died, Sidney was down there. Sidney Brock came to our house, and Dan was telling that story, But he was, it seemed that he could do anything. And the young people, he didn't know any difference in the young and old. They all, and he never aged. He never seemed to age from the time we were married until the last few years when he fell, and broke his hip.
Sidney Brock, the older Sidney Brock, goes way, way back there in Oklahoma City history.
Oh, yeah, so Mr. Hogan.
Yes, I know that.
But now Mr. Hogan is very much like Mr. Gaylord, Sr. And they never seemed to grow old. They both loved bridge, but of course his wife was ill, and she was more his age, and they never attended it. But we used to go to country club parties, and Mr. Gaylord liked bridge. He was a lover of bridge. It is fascinating, and so was Mr. Hogan. But Mr. Hogan had wonderful health, and he never seemed to change.
Do you recall the earlier Oklahoma City country clubs, the one on about 50th and
39th Street or something?
Well, yes, let's talk about the one on 39th.
Well, see, they had the bank in the old Huckins Hotel, Hugh and Frank and Mr. Hogan. And they were out at the country club, a bunch of them, and they said that the hotel was on fire. And they raced back in, and Dan said he pulled his desk out on the sidewalk, because he was as I understood it, the principal loan man. He knew how to make loans, and in fact, I think that is the essential part of any bank. If you make they can't all be perfect, but he said, I like to go home at night with my desk cleared, and knowing that so I can sleep well, that I haven't made has every appearance of being one that can be collected. And he said, after all, this isn't our money. He said, this is the people's money. And he was known as a very conservative banker.
Go ahead. Yes.
Dave, would you tell that story that you told me that time about the people that were going to the party and they thought that they were going to the country club? I don't remember the name. You said that someone was giving a grand party and they had a beautiful home, and two of the guests rang the doorbell.
Well, that's Dr. Nichols. Did you?
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know him, but I
Well,
knew
of course, he built that enormous
Yes, I
home
know
out
he
there.
was.
It looks like the country club.
Oh, yes.
And so we were out there one night. He was very hospitable. Of course, when we were married, I thought, I just cannot stand to go to these things. Every night, every Thursday night, we belonged to a bridge club, and all. I thought, I just can't stand it. But it wasn't more than a month or two till I was delighted. I was looking forward to it. But we went out to Dr. Nichols one night, and he was having a huge party, And so I went in. There was a couple came in. I was standing there talking to Dr. Nichols, and he spoke to him, and they wandered around, and they said, "Well, is this a country club?" Because they saw all the cars, and they thought, and it's as big as a country club. And he said, "Oh no, but just go right on in and help yourself. There's plenty at the buffet table, you know." That must have been 200 out there, you know. And so they did, and they left and went on to the country club. But he was just. I never have seen more hospitable people than Dr. and Mrs. Nichols.
Who were some of Mr. Hogan's earlier associates, the ones he may have talked about? You mentioned Sidney Brock. Who were some of the others he was close to in the generation ahead of you that he may?
Well, the head of this Sidney Brock's mother. The Fredericksons and the early, I think they had the OG&E, weren't they?
No, Oklahoma National.
Oklahoma National. Well, they.
George Frederickson.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Frederickson girl married the Brock boy, or vice versa. It is the Brock girl. I guess. No, because Sidney's Brock, and all the old Mr. and Mrs. Harbor,
Mm-hmm.
and of course Dr. Hood is not that old, but he was. He was a personal friend, and Mr. and Miss Harbor and Dr. and Miss Nichols.
J.F. Harbor, I forgot the first name.
Harbor Longmire.
I knew it.
He belonged to this little bridge, the bridge club we did, and well, all the old timers, Mr. and Miss Gloyd.
Mm-hmm.
You know them?
Yeah, I know that's the old Gloyd Halliburton.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but
no, I didn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, she was his secretary. She was much younger too.
Is that right?
She and I had quite something in common, you know, because we thought we'd married two of the smartest men in Oklahoma City and the most prominent, definitely. But he always. Now this, what you gonna do with this? I don't want anybody else to hear some of this.
Oh, this is most interesting.
Well, I know, but
you don't. What you don't want to be heard, you don't need to say. But what you're saying is most interesting.
But I was saying that Mr. Gloyd always seemed old to me, and Mr. Hogan never did.
Mm-hmm.
He when we went to conventions, he said, he wanted to get up early and do everything there was to do, and if they had any trap shooting and like that, he did that. And he was a strictly one of the big hotels here, the Wells Robert, did business with him, Wells, and he'd always advise. He knew a young man. He said, and I know, he hadn't married, he was 28 years old. He said, I know you're keeping money in your box, your safety box. So now I can't get in there, but I know you are. He said, now you'd better get it out, and began to declare it. And he said, you cannot fool around with the Internal Revenue. And but he didn't, and in a few years he stepped out and bought a big car or some more land and paid cash for it. And they just, jumped that out. He's told me so many stories. And this Wells, the federal men came into the bank one day and said, we want to examine Mr. Wells' account. See, that was during the war. That was before we were married. And that was not before the war, but during the Second World War. And he said, well, now, just wait a minute. He said, I'll have to talk to him. But, of course, he knew they could. So he called him. He said, well, Dan, you'll just have to let them examine it. So he did, and they'd kept, two sets of books. Now, I don't know whether I should tell that or not. It's it's gone now.
Sure.
But they put him in the pen and fined him $80,000. But Dan, his one remarkable, what would you say? He never nagged. After something was done and he advised you, he never brought it up again. He never said, I told you you should have done it.
Mr. Frederickson came down I believe as a railroad conductor when he came into Oklahoma City originally.
Oh, did he?
Yes.
Now, a lot of that I don't know. And Judge and Mrs. Cochran were very good friends of ours. And, all the old timers, the Thurmans, that built that huge house over there right across from Frank Johnson High Tower. That's been Dan and his first wife were in this bridge club. Now, turn that off.
Sure. We're
Back
good
at
to
the
go.
back.
Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
we got 1 minute. We're gonna use it. I want to. Do you recall the country club at about 49th and Walker? Was that, or does that precede your being here?
49. Yes, that precedes.
That precedes you. What about the one at 36th and Walker, where First Christian Church is now, the old Edgemere Country Club? Do you remember anything about it?
No.
You do not. Only the one at 39th, up close to where Crown Heights Christian is. Mm-hmm.
Well, the country club, golf and country
Well,
club.
the earlier one was at 39th,
Yes, I
around
know it was.
39th.
That's when they drove in and
Yes, that's
pulled
when
their
the
desk
fire.
out with a fire.
The on the on the do you recall any of the downtown clubs? Now, there's the Empire Room, and there was there's the old Oklahoma Club before the Persian Room.
Yeah, before the person.
yeah.
It was over there in the Skirvin, in the old Skirvin, you know. What is that one that called? That's where they had the Lotus Club.
Yeah.
He was Mr. Hogan was president of the Oklahoma Bankers at one time. He was president of the Lotus Club, but he also the Oklahoma Club down there, and he had. We didn't frequent all of them, you know, and the Cellar Club and all. But the boys in the bank did, you know. They had that for them to entertain customers.
Do you recall the old one where Anna Maud's is now? The club there, it brought in some very fine entertainment, I understood, prior to the Anna Maud's.
You mean down there in the basement?
Down in the basement, yes. It was quite a club.
Well, I know
Brought in
I
nice
didn't.
folks.
Is that so?
You recall it before Anna Maud's? Apparently not.
No, I don't.
We're out of time.
There was one in the
yes.
Huckins, you know. And
Yes.
they had a wonderful dining room down there, and they had colored waiters, and you know, the cuisine there was superb.
Beautiful.
And everything had the damask tablecloths. It was something
Huckins
lovely that you
Ballroom.
like to go
Yes.
to.
Huckins Ballroom.
But that was for he and I were married.
Yes.
I think that was gone.
This has been an interview with Mrs. Dan Hogan in April 1975.